Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very last lecture for Poly 130. This is a big day for us because this is the last time that you will, well, actually, it's not the last time you'll hear my voice, but it's the last time that you'll hear me talk about an issue in depth relating to political science. And today we're going to be talking about something super interesting, the role of democratic deconsolidation, which we'll learn about what that is in a second, and the rise of authoritarian populism in the contemporary age. But before we get into that, as always, we get into our housekeeping. Hold on, let me switch the view here. Read mode. Okay. So housekeeping items, as you might have seen last week, I did switch up the lecture schedule slightly. And so in lieu of a lecture next class, we're actually going to have a final review session. So on Wednesday, April 22nd, same bat time, same bat place, we will be having a live final review session where you guys can ask me questions, any questions that you have about the final, whether it be the structure or questions about what you should be studying, how you should be studying. The only thing I won't answer is questions about exactly what questions are going to be on the final, obviously. But if you come up with hypothetical questions, then I can kind of instruct you on how one might go about answering things like that. So tune in Wednesday, April 22nd at 11:15 a.m. It's going to be a live session. So we're going to start at 11:15 as we typically do, so that you guys can ask your questions. If you feel like you aren't going to be able to log into the meeting at that time, you could always submit your questions in the final tab on our Slack site, and I can answer questions from there as well. The session will be recorded, so if you happen to be in a different time zone, you can just watch it later. The final exam is also coming up in a couple of weeks. So the final exam for my honors class is May the 4th. For the just regular Poly 130 class is May the 5th. As I said last class, the final is going to be on Sakai. It will be one that you can do online by submitting a PDF of your answers. And my strong recommendation, it's going to be available for 36 hours, although you will have only 4 hours to complete the exam once you open it. And my strong recommendation to avoid any type of technical problems is that you open the document, right, save it, answer the questions in Word, make sure to save throughout, and then post it on Sakai as a PDF when you're done. We can talk about that during the review session tomorrow. And then finally, don't forget that you have to turn in your participation assignment to get full participation points for this semester. And those will be due at the very latest on April the 26th. So if you haven't submitted a reading guide, if your TA allows a discussion question or a reading reflection, then you should do so before April 26th. Otherwise, you will be deducted points from your participation grade. So today, like I said, we're going to talk about democratic deconsolidation. And I want to start off with kind of the story that was in the reading that you guys talked about, right? So there's a story of a kind of unlikely political candidate who rises to power in a democratic election by a slight margin. This person had no real political experience coming into this office. And over the course, but people thought that he would be a great reformer, right? He was going to get corruption out of politics, kind of change the way that politics was run in his country. Now, what actually ended up happening during his campaign is that he introduced more corruption than he took out. He began to assail the media as false news whenever they would report on this corruption, and in general, the quality of the democracy of the country that he ran eventually deteriorated over the course of his tenure. Now, what I liked about How Democracies Die is that they build this story, and clearly we all had someone in mind. It's unclear who we had in mind, right? But we had someone in mind as we went through the story of this unlikely political candidate rising to power and slowly eroding the quality of democracy. But the candidate that they had in mind is actually Alberto Fujimori, who was the president of Peru during, I believe, the 1990s. And again, Fujimori was an outsider political candidate, rose to power, and slowly but surely during his reign brought the quality of Peru's democracy, which had been somewhat long-standing, down to a level that it could almost be considered autocratic. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, this process which we call democratic deconsolidation. So our guiding questions are: A, what is democratic deconsolidation? 2, how do we get consolidated democracies to weaken? And 3, a kind of related question of what explains the rise of right-wing populism, both in the United States today, but also in the world at large. So to get to the first question, what is democratic deconsolidation? Well, it's the process by which democratic norms, support, or practices erode in an otherwise established and longstanding democracy. And the key to this is that the democracy has to have been consolidated, right? We've seen before that we see these kind of early transitions to democracy that can very easily kind of swing backwards to autocracy. We saw that in Zambia, right? That we saw the institution of multi-party elections, but just years later, we got an almost full-blown authoritarian regime under Chiluba. And that's not really what we're talking about, right? Because Zambia kind of started on the process to democracy, but never quite consolidated its democracy, right? It never was considered a full democracy for a number of years. But when we're talking about democratic deconsolidation, what we're talking about is how these long-standing democracies, countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, countries like Chile, for example, that had had democracy for 150 years before Pinochet came in, how those countries gradually erode their democratic institutions, their democratic practices, or their democratic norms to kind of revert into either a weaker form of democracy, or in some cases, like Chile, a wholesale autocracy. So some of the features here is that in democracy, or when democracies are deconsolidating, democracy is no longer seen as the only game in town, right? It's no longer seen as the only system that works for this country. And we can actually see some evidence of this happening in several consolidated democracies around the world. So the World Values Survey is a survey that happens generally every 4 or so years in selected countries around the world. And they ask a lot of questions about the quality of democracy in your country, what you think is important for democracy, etc. And one of the questions that they ask is whether citizens believe that a good way to run the country is to have a strong leader that doesn't have to bother with elections. Now, obviously, this is anti-democratic because we tend to think of free and fair elections as a fundamental part of democracy. Yet in several countries that have long-standing democracies, Argentina, Armenia, India, Germany, South Africa, etc., we see that tons of people actually believe that strong leaders who don't have to bother with elections could be a good way of running their country. So, for example, in Brazil, we see that the rate of people believing this is a fairly good idea is about 20-something%, but the people who believe this is a very good idea, quite high. So the approval ratings for these things in places like Romania, in places like India, even in places like Taiwan is actually pretty high. And in all cases, the number of people that think this is good is well over, in most cases, it's well over 30%, right? So even though it varies, there are a lot of cases where people think that a leader who is strong, who doesn't have to bother with elections, is a good thing for the country. And that's a clear sign that some of the values of democracy are deconsolidating, and that people think, oh, democracy isn't the only thing that works. We could have other forms of governance that might actually work for this country. But it's important to note that, as I said before, these are not necessarily reversions to autocracy. Just because a democracy is deconsolidating doesn't actually mean that it's switching wholesale to an autocracy. As we saw earlier in the class, the number of democracies has actually increased over time. But what we're seeing is actually just kind of like the weakening of democracy, right? That people might not be changing overall to autocracy. There are some cases where that's the case, but in most cases, it's just that countries are moving further away from their peak points of democracy. So if we look at this scale, yellow countries are those that have stayed the same, right? So from 2010 to 2018, their polity score, that measure of democracy that we've used before in this class, hasn't changed. But as we start getting closer to the red, we see that there are places where the quality of democracy has weakened over time. And some of those places are actually longstanding democracies. So in the US, the quality of our democracy has weakened from 2010 to 2018. In the UK, in Ukraine, and then we see places like Mali, we see places like Sudan, where the quality of democracy has weakened a lot more. And then there are lots of places where the quality of democracy, these are previously autocratic places where the quality of democracy has increased a bit. But in very few cases, the only case where we see a wholesale kind of reversion to autocracy from democracy is in a case like Turkey, or in a case like Nepal, right? So these are just kind of slight weakenings of democracy that happen gradually over time. So how does this happen, though? How do we go from consolidated democracy to a much weaker form of democracy? And this is a big puzzle for political science, because we often think of consolidated democracies as kind of the final evolution of democracy, and you don't go backwards. So if you happen to have been a Pokemon person when you were young, like I was, it's kind of like once you get to the Venusaur stage of a Bulbasaur, you don't go backwards to Ivysaur, right? You're stuck where you are in the final evolution. And so that is how we used to think of democracy. Once you get to a consolidated democracy, chances are, unless there's some like huge economic crisis, some huge exogenous shock, you're not going to weaken the quality of democracy. You're kind of in that final stage. So the question of how this process happens is actually pretty important for us to answer. And there's a number of theories, some of which are presented in the readings that you did about how democracies die. One, there can be a change in the norms and values in society that weakens the quality of democracy. So people can just start to believe in democracy a lot less. Also, the practices of democracy can change. So we can have certain institutions become weaker, certain democratic practices not actually come into place anymore, right? Not be exercised anymore. And then finally, leaders can have a really big effect. And that's what was talked about a lot in the piece, How Democracies Die, that you read, is how individual leaders can slowly but surely, and maybe even inadvertently, weaken the quality of democracy over time by, for example, launching attacks on the media, etc. So we're going to go through all of these, and then we're going to look at a specific case study of a democracy that people are really worried about dying, to kind of finish up our discussion. So first, for norms and values, we can look at the way in which certain liberal values that we often think are coincident with democracy, right, go along with democracy, weaken over time. So on the one hand, we need to realize that there is what we call a life cycle effect in citizens' kind of satisfaction with democracy, or their feeling of importance of democracy. And that is that older people tend to be more satisfied with the quality of democracy than younger people. That might surprise you a little, but it's actually common in sociology that older people tend to be more conservative, right? Younger people tend to be more radical. And so they might be the ones who believe that the current state of democracy is unsatisfying because it does not meet their radical vision of what a democracy should look like. And we've seen that slightly in the United States with the growth of more radical leftist movements, right? A lot of people in the US that are younger happen to think that things like free healthcare, things like eliminating student debt, et cetera, are eliminating inequality, are key qualities of democracy. Now, clearly our democracy does not do that. And so they may be more dissatisfied with democracy than, say, a 50-year-old who believes that really the defining characteristics of democracy are just free and fair votes, regular transitions in elections, things like this. And so what we see is actually as one decreases in age, right, as we get to younger populations, the number of people who actually think that democracy is important decreases over time. So there is some weakening of either approval of democracy or democratic norms, and that doesn't just hold for the US. We also see that happening in a lot of different European countries. So in places like Finland, we see a decrease. In Italy, we see a decrease. I don't know why this one is blank. So there's kind of a general declining trend that the younger you are in your age cohort, the less likely it is that you're going to believe that that democracy is an important thing to hold. Now, obviously, what we should expect is that this will fade out over time, right? As our 18-year-olds become older, then they will too become more satisfied with democracy. So maybe this is a temporary effect, this deconsolidation, that disappears as people age. Another thing, perhaps a more worrying thing because it's more long lasting, is how the practices or institutions of democracy decline over time. And that's kind of one of the central points of the Levitsky and Ziblatt reading, is that in general, we are looking at the slow erosion of our democratic institutions, whether by someone actually trying to directly erode the quality of them, or just a slow decay over time. So some kind of as evidence of how things that we think are democratic can actually be used for undemocratic means, we can think of recent government shutdowns, right? And these were prompted because of our voting rules in the Senate, right? So we have voting rules that allow for majorities to block legislation, that allow for presidents to block legislation. And generally we think of those as democratic practice, right? They are checks and balances that prevent one group from having too much power. And yet in recent years, we have seen how that power, how those institutions that are supposed to be democratic and allow for more even-handed politics have actually been used to exacerbate polarization in politics and really cause problems for the running of government. Because certain groups of elites had more control over the political system, they were able to do things like not approve budgets that caused shutdowns in the government, that caused people to lose income, etc. So that's something that we thought was a democratic practice kind of being used to undemocratic ends. We also have more, let's say, explicit corrosion of democracy through things like gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is basically the rewriting of districts in order to produce certain types of majorities. So we can consider a sample district like the one here, right? There are 50 precincts in this district. 40% of them are red, 60% of them are blue. And so in a perfectly proportional system, we would expect 60 seats to go to blue and 40 seats to go to, or 60% of seats to go to blue, 40% of seats to go to red. And so if there were 5 seats, we would expect 3 blue, 2 red. Now, in a single member district system where districts are just kind of lined up very evenly, right? We split this into 5 even blocks. What we see is we do get an unrepresentative outcome, as we've seen before. There are 5 districts and 5 of those would be blue. So basically we get 100% of blue representation and no red representation. But we can also gerrymander these districts, right? Redraw them in specific ways to produce different types of majorities. And even in a single member district rule, when we gerrymander the district, when we draw these interesting Tetris pieces, we can do is bias the outcome in favor of red. So here, these 2 districts end up being mostly blue, so we get a blue candidate there. There's 2 blue candidates. But these districts end up being mostly red, and so we get overrepresentation of the red party. And that is well over their proportional system and over the normal single member district rule. So things like gerrymandering is this is completely in line with the practices of, like nobody is doing anything illegal necessarily. Senates are allowed to draw districts as they wish. But clearly it's producing an outcome that is unequal, right? And that we tend to think is bad for democracy. So that's another example. And then finally, another example is how attacks have been made against the press. And this is a really easy way and a very subtle way to erode the quality of democracy, because an independent and free media that people trust is essential for people to make informed decisions, to place a check on the government, etc. But as we get the proliferation of fake news, or we get the censorship of independent media, we can weaken the quality of democracy, because there is no one, either in the case of censorship, there's no one left to check the government, and basically all news sources are government-based sources, which clearly is a conflict of interest. Or in the case of fake news, right, we create so much confusion in the system that independent media is no longer trusted, right, no longer recognized as a trusted source. And so people do not have the necessary information to make smart democratic decisions. So the progressive weakening of institutions, which we've seen, right? We've seen districts become more gerrymandered, especially even in our state of North Carolina, right? There are tons of big cases around gerrymandering in North Carolina. We've seen the proliferation of at least the mythology of fake news media, and actually fake news media being spread on things like social media, etc. And so these are the types of things that weaken the quality of democracy. Finally, we need to look at the role of leaders in weakening the quality of democracy. And remember that we had an argument that suggested that our democracy in the United States was actually very contingent upon leadership, right? In week 6, we read a piece that suggested that we might not have the same democracy that we have today if it weren't for the kind of benevolent actions of George Washington, right? His decision to step down from power, his decision not to become king, etc. So we see that the choices of leaders can actually have big consequences, huge ramifications for the quality of our democracy. Now, what we see today that's more worrying for democracy is the growth of what we call right-wing populist governments. And that is a populist government, so a government that kind of focuses on the people, right, tries to provide government for the people and focuses away from kind of what they call establishment elites, so away from elitism, more towards the demos. But these governments are based around right-wing ideals, i.e. the ideas of nativism, which is kind of giving resources to people that were born in the country or citizens of the country in question. Authoritarian value orientation, so a focus on rule of law, a focus on obedience, and economic and political conservatism. And we've seen the rise of these leaders in several democratic countries. So in Hungary, we have Viktor Orban. In France, we have Marine Le Pen. And in the US, we have Donald Trump, who kind of espouses these views. As we know, in the US, we have this kind of "Make America Great Again" slogan, the huge focus on the rule of law and on protecting our borders, and on economic conservatism, anti-elite bias, anti-establishment bias, etc. So the growth of these leaders who promote what some would say is a more illiberal vision of democracy can also help to erode the quality of consolidated democracies. And we've seen the rise of these leaders not only in the three cases that I talked about just then, but throughout different countries, particularly in Europe. So in Austria, we can see that radical right parties have grown quite significantly. In Sweden, we get the rise of the radical right. Even in Italy, Denmark, somewhat in the UK, in France, which is where Marine Le Pen is from. So yeah, this is not just a limited phenomenon. It's actually happening in a lot of places across the world. So what explains the rise of these right-wing populists? Like how is it that these people get into power if we think that some of their ideals happen to be threatening to democracy? And the way that we're going to look at this is through a case study, that case study being that of the United States. Typically, we don't talk about the US in this class, but I think this is one place where it's actually good to focus on US politics and things closer to home. So we're going to look at this through the lens of trying to explain the rise of one Donald J. Trump as our president and his popularity over the course of the past couple of years. So to make sense of the rise of both right-wing populism, but Donald Trump specifically, we have several arguments that can come to us from theory, and many of which kind of flow from that literature on democratic deconsolidation. So on the one hand, we might think that our values have shifted, right? That we want something new out of our democracy. And so since Donald Trump is providing those things that we want, that is why he might be popular. Another thing, there might be certain qualities of his leadership that draw citizens to want to vote for him and to support his policies. There might be some institutional weaknesses in our democracy that led to his rise in power and his ability to win such a big office. And another theory that I think may have been talked about in your reading, we surely would have covered it had it not been for the COVID crisis, but the role of inequality and insecurity in driving people to vote for radical right parties and elites, etc. So let's start with our shifting values and expectations. Now, remember that the argument that we made with democratic deconsolidation is that today, and especially among younger citizens, they hold different values and tend to expect more of democracy. So any dissatisfaction with the quality of democracy represents a disconnect between how democracy is performing today and the expectations that we have for how our democracy should perform. And we see some of this, right, with the rise of Trump. There was extreme kind of criticism in his campaign of the establishment elite and the way that democracy had been run before and whose interests democracy was meant to serve. So we might expect that there's some increase in or shift in value orientation, perhaps towards more liberal values among the population that kind of want to get away from the status quo. And that is why we get the rise of Donald Trump, because he was promising kind of these more liberal, more redistributive policies towards people, and a real change from the way that from politics as is. However, the data does not seem to bear this out. Um, in general, I would say that it seems that more illiberal values seem to be correlated with um, support for Donald Trump. So rather than kind of the values that we hold as key to liberal democracy, so um, support for sexual freedom, support for racial tolerance, etc., what we see is that actually racial animus, so resentment of other races, animosity towards Black influence, tend to be predictors of Trump support, pretty strong predictors of Trump support. And so Trump voters actually tend to have more illiberal visions of democracy than not. And this actually tracks with a lot of support for radical right parties in general. Overall, they tend to be more illiberal and authoritarian in their value orientation. And this is kind of encapsulated in this quote by Viktor Orban, that his kind of whole campaign, this is the current ruler in Hungary, who is known for kind of being a radical right populist, but his kind of statement about how his administration runs and kind of his popularity is this idea that people needed to state that democracy doesn't have to be liberal, right? Liberal democracy isn't the only game in town. You can still be a democracy and be in a liberal democracy, one that focuses on more conservative values, more nativist values, etc. And that's what we honestly see, that there we see a correlation between these, what we tend to call illiberal values, nativism, authoritarian value orientation, et cetera, and support for these radical right leaders. Another thing might focus on the leadership aspect, and it is undoubtable that Trump does have some type of charismatic sway over his supporters, right? A lot of people like Trump for the idea that he is a no-nonsense politician, that he says what he means. And while other politicians happen to be playing the game of politics, right, hiding things from the people, Trump does not have those qualities. He is he's honest, he's forthright, etc. And some people are actually drawn to that, right? That one of the kind of hallmarks of populist leaders is that they are anti-establishment, they're anti-elite, they tend to be much more kind of homegrown, they have this kind of quality of being much like a regular, average, everyday person. And so that could be one of the things that are drawing people into the Trump campaign, is his ability to kind of speak their language and present himself as, you know, just a kind of regular guy who is fighting for everyday Joes like himself. Another issue that might have led to Trump's rise is the possible weakening of our democratic institutions, something that we had overlooked, kind of where our weak spots might have been. And that has happened in several places. Some people argue that we wouldn't have gotten a candidate like Trump if we had a multi-party system, right? If we had a system that allowed for more candidates, then perhaps he might have been allocated to a third party that would have, or third or fourth party rather, that wouldn't have gotten as many votes. Others argue that the reason Trump was able to ascend to such a high point even within the Republican Party is flaws in the primary system, right? So very few people tend to vote in primaries. Those people tend to be on the more extreme sides of ideology because they are the ones who are paying attention to politics, the ones who even bother to go out. And that primary process tends to produce more extreme candidates. And so if we hadn't had a primary, perhaps we would have gotten, I don't know, I don't even think Paul Ryan really ran, but maybe we would have gotten Jeb Bush instead of instead of Donald Trump in the general election in 2016. Finally, people have also looked at the role of, obviously, the Electoral College in producing a win for Donald Trump. If you recall, in 2016, Hillary Clinton did win the general election by a slight margin, but lost the Electoral College. And so some people believe that the Electoral College biases our electoral outcomes in favor of certain groups versus others, and in particular allows rural America to have much more of a role in deciding who our next president will be than the more densely populated urban areas. Finally, people have also looked at the role of media in possibly contributing to Trump's rise. If you remember, during the 2016 election, there was a lot of coverage of Trump, but some people argue that the media did not critique his campaign at the level that they should have, right? We're willing to normalize some of the behaviors that he displayed during that campaign, and sensationalized problems with other campaigns, such that Trump was able to benefit from his news coverage, right? That he was basically, as this image depicts, a Pied Piper, kind of leading the news in the direction that he wanted it to go, which helped his campaign. So the argument is, had it not been for kind of systemic weaknesses in our institutions, whether that be the primary process, the Electoral College, the scrutiny of our media, then we might not have gotten this rise. And then finally, one of the theories that has gotten more and more attention, I think, over the past 4 years is the role of economic inequality and economic insecurity in promoting Donald Trump's rise. And this is just the idea that people who feel economically insecure compared to other groups are more likely to vote for populists who advocate for things like redistribution, or in the case of Trump, promise to bring back resources to previously underprivileged or under-resourced communities. So a big part of his campaign in 2016 was that we were going to revitalize things like the coal industry, that we were going to change our trade agreements with China so that we could bring jobs back to the US. And that really appealed, the thought was that this really appealed to poorer communities in places like Ohio and places like Michigan, where jobs had been transferred away and industries have been dying. However, this doesn't seem to track fully with the data. As it turns out, poorer people, as evidenced by exit polling from the 2016 election, poor people tended to vote for Hillary Clinton more than they did Donald Trump. So if you're making under 30K, actually, if you were making under 50K, you tended to be a Clinton voter more than you were a Trump voter. So if, in fact, inequality was the thing that was driving people's support for Trump, we should expect that poorer people were more likely to vote for Trump than Clinton, and that's just not the case, right? It tended to be the case that poorer people tended to vote for Clinton, and on the richer side of the distribution, it skewed slightly Trump, or was pretty even for Trump and Clinton. Another thing is that even when we do individual kind of regressions, right, not comparing the two, we see that the probability of voting for Trump isn't really affected by things like the loss of manufacturing jobs, right, actual economic dislocation. So a study done in 2017 tried to investigate what caused people to switch in favor of Trump from their first preferred candidate in the primary. And we see that among all parties, there's generally a flat line, right? That the probability of voting for or switching to Trump is not at all affected by whether you had a very low level of economic dislocation or whether you had a very high level of economic dislocation. And in fact, if you are a Republican voter who switched to Trump, the level of the more economically dislocated you are, right? The more jobs in manufacturing that were lost in your district, the less likely you were to vote for Trump. So it doesn't seem to be the case that inequality per se, like actual inequality, had any role in driving votes for Trump. However, what does seem to have affected it is how people felt their own economic decline was, right? So the objective conditions of whether they were actually worse off didn't matter. But if you felt like you were worse off, if you perceived that your economic situation had declined over the past couple of years, then it definitely increased your likelihood of voting for Trump. Particularly if you were a Republican, your likelihood increases from about 60 or so percent to well over 75% of voting for Trump if you feel as though you've experienced some type of economic decline. So it does seem to be the case that even though inequality might not matter, insecurity might matter, right? The idea that you should be doing better than you are, and that has caused you some type of insecurity with your economic situation. And in fact, this is exacerbated by the level of anti-immigrant attitudes that happen to be in the population. So if in fact you believe that you've had personal decline and you have anti-immigrant attitudes, then your probability of voting for Trump increases by a lot, right? So not only are the people who voted for Trump those that feel economically insecure, but they also might feel demographically insecure because there is some latent anti-immigrant attitude that they have. Maybe they think that immigrants are taking their jobs. It's unclear, but it is clear that there is a correlation between having anti-immigrant attitude seems to increase your likelihood of voting for Trump. And that is in fact not just the case with Trump, that is the case with a lot of radical right parties. If we measure anti-immigrant values, the number of people that say that immigration is an important issue that we should focus on, and the percentage of the vote for the populist right, we do see some general correlations in a lot of countries where the populist right has increased in their vote share. So in Austria, Finland, France, Italy, the Netherlands, there seems to be a general correlation between whether you have some worry about immigration and whether you vote for these parties. So insecurity does seem to be playing a big role here. So just to sum up, I think that what this lecture shows us is that both democratic deconsolidation and support for right-wing populism are very new trends, and they could be worrisome, right? It is possible that these things will fade over time, that it's really just a short-term phenomenon or a fad. But if this is to persist, then yes, we do have very worrisome trends because, again, we tend to assume that consolidated democracies will stay that way. If we see those countries, like the ones that have maintained democracy for a very long time, kind of backsliding into kind of lesser forms of democracy and possibly autocracy, then we might see what we call a reverse wave of democracy, right? That we see the number of autocracies slowly increasing over time. And as we know, that makes it harder for democracy to survive. The more autocracies we have in the system, the harder it is for democracies for countries to transition to democracy and for new democracies to survive over time. Now, interestingly enough, because this is such a new trend, there isn't enough data to have very definitive answers, right? There are tons of studies coming out about this, but none of them, even on the studies that I showed you with Trump, are definitive, right? There are studies that will contradict that and studies that find kind of different things. So we need more data and we need more time to study these things. But what does seem to what the data does seem to show pretty consistently is that insecurity and xenophobia drive support for both democratic deconsolidation, so drives support for more reversions to more autocratic forms of government, and also the rise of radical right populism. And this is kind of encapsulated through this cartoon about Germany, that those who are economically disoriented and those who have some type of racial bias can come together in a grand coalition that then can oppose democratic practice in countries like Germany by supporting radical right-wing leaders and parties. And then finally, we really do need to focus, I think, more not on how citizens hold these views, but the way that parties and political elites can activate fears and cleavages. I didn't include it here, but there is some evidence. A study recently came out that showed that even though anti-immigrant positions didn't very much affect your vote for Donald Trump and in the early stages of the campaign, so in 2015, there wasn't much effect. The minute that he mentions building the wall, then we see anti-immigrant values highly predict support for Trump. And anytime he kind of has these, there was a statement that he had about kind of equating Mexican citizens with rapists, and we saw another big jump in how anti-immigrant beliefs affected support for Trump. So it could be the case that political elites are specifically activating certain fears or specifically activating certain cleavages in order to get votes for themselves. And we saw this kind of with the ethnic politics literature, how elites can kind of play upon citizens' latent values and latent behaviors and turn them into something that can be mobilized around for conflict or for votes. So that is the sum of this lecture. I hate to end on such a sobering note, but on a more positive note, we made it. We did it. Definitely not the semester we expected, but we got through it. Hopefully you learned a lot about politics, and that you are, as excited about finishing, but also as excited about having gone through this class as I am about having been able to teach it. I hope to see you all, or as many of you as possible, on Wednesday to ask questions about the final. And, I didn't want to end this way. I would have loved to see you guys on the last day, and I don't know. I don't know what would have happened. Maybe we would have all given each other a big round of applause for having made it through this. And that is how I would have wished to end this semester. But even from far away, I'm super excited to have gone through this process with you guys. I hope you learned something. I hope you'll remember Poly 130 is more than a terrible dumpster fire because of COVID-19. And hopefully, you'll continue to engage with the political science department and political science courses over time. So hope to see you guys on Wednesday for that review session. Hopefully I'll get to see your faces at least once more. And I wish you the best of luck going forward for your final and for the rest of the semester and all of your other classes. Talk to you guys later. Bye.